Under the leadership of the Glassman administration, Harford County government, the Harford County Sheriff's Office, the Health Department, and Harford County Public Schools have fostered an unprecedented partnership to address the heroin epidemic that is devastating our communities. We work closely every day to implement new initiatives, share information, and develop resources to raise awareness about addiction, improve access to treatment, and attain successful outcomes for addicts and their families. It is my pleasure and honor to introduce you to some of our esteemed partners who are serving on our panel this morning. Joe Ryan, manager of the Harford County Office of Drug Control Policy, Harford County Sheriff Jeffrey Gaylor, and Dr. Julie Stancliffe, Associate Medical Director with the University of Maryland Upper Chesapeake Health System and the Medical Director of the Harford County Health Department Behavioral Health Services Division. To fight this battle, it is critical to understand why heroin is so addictive, how addictions develop, and the obstacles to achieving and maintaining sobriety. John Wanner, an expert in the field of opiate addiction and the impact of opioids on the brain, has joined us this morning to begin our panel discussion with a presentation on his research and experience as a drug and alcohol addictions counselor. After his presentation, John will join our panel and answer any questions that the audience has. John holds master's degrees in chemical engineering, psychology, and business administration, and has worked in the field of addiction and treatment for over 12 years. He is on the front lines of the Harford County fight against heroin, and his insights and support have been instrumental to us. Please join me in welcoming John.
Good morning, everybody. I just want to say it's an honor for me to be here. I want to thank the county executives for giving me this opportunity. I've worked in the addictions field actually over 20 years. I've also been in my own recovery from alcoholism for over 32 years now. 6 years ago, I had a young man that was in my group when I worked at Father Martin's Ashley. His name was Will. This young man was 23 years old. Will had been in 9 treatment facilities prior to coming to Father Martin's, never once completed a treatment facility. Second week in treatment, he came into my office and he said, "Now's the time. I'm ready." We worked real hard in his last 2 weeks. He stayed the full 4 weeks. Will was an industrial engineer, had a degree in industrial engineering. His father had a business that he was starting, and Will was very excited about his future and was motivated to make a go of this new venture. He discharged from Father Martin's on a Saturday afternoon at 12 o'clock noon. He was flying out the next day to leave Northern Virginia, where he was living, to go to Mississippi, where his father had this new business. He was excited about that opportunity, and he thought of nothing more than that. Went home that day, had a great time with his family. They had dinner. And at 7 o'clock that night, he said to his family, "I want to go say goodbye to my friends." 3 o'clock in the morning, his mother found him with a needle in his arm. It was at that moment that I recognized that heroin addiction is not like alcoholism. I had up to that point thought that it was all the same. But the reality of it is, when somebody relapses on alcohol, they usually don't die right away. But with heroin, it happens way too often. First time out, overdose and die. We need to take a much different approach when we look at heroin. And many people have talked about this whole idea of education and prevention. I'm retired now, so I have an opportunity to do some different things. I take a little different position on prevention than what's been talked about here. I think Keith did a very great job of illustrating what the addict's mind is like. But what we need to understand is there's a big difference between an adult addict and a 20-year-old addict. The brain of those individuals is much different. And some of the techniques that you use for older people don't necessarily work. Many people have talked about the importance of educating our young people about opiates. It doesn't start with opiates. It starts with smoking, it starts with marijuana, and it starts with alcohol. And what we need to really do is we need to do a better job of not just telling the young people in school and their parents, don't use drugs. A year ago, I did this presentation, and fortunately, there were 20 young people there from a local high school. The presentation wasn't geared towards young people. After it was over, 3 young girls from that high school came up to me and said, you know, they tell us all the time in school not to use drugs, but they never explain to us why. They never explain to us why we shouldn't use it. Why are we potentially at risk? What I've put together is an educational program that helps you understand what happens neurobiologically to the brain. All right? When you understand, first of all, what addiction is, the American Society of Addiction Medicine defined addiction as a disorder of the brain, disease of the brain. Circuits in the brain that are basically modulating our survival, reward, memory, and motivation are turned upside down as a result of alcohol and drug use. A lot of the things that Keith talked about having that motivation because of consequences, they don't necessarily apply to the young people because their brains don't work that way. And as we understand this, and as we can educate them, and as we can educate parents about how these things happen, we can start to make some kind of a dent. You know, the multi-pronged approach that's being applied in Maryland now, I think, is one that is necessary. But we got to remember, the drug business is a business. You look at what's going on today. You know, we talk about fentanyl. Well, fentanyl's passé right now. There's this new thing called carfentanil, which is a lot more potent than fentanyl. And we're going to see that over and over again. It's going to be a constant battle where the drug suppliers are going to come up with something new and more exciting. And we've got to reach not just the young people at the early age as they do. We've got to help them understand why, what actually goes on. And more importantly, we've got to understand the parents. The gentleman that came up here earlier, you know, I've heard a lot of parents talk like he did. Their brains don't work that way. And as we understand how the brain functions, we can start to do some things differently. Addiction is a multi-pronged approach. The brain doesn't get altered by just one factor. In a lot of cases, genetics plays a large role in it. When you start looking at something like heroin addiction or opiate addiction, you're probably looking about 60 to 70% of addiction to those substances can be explained by genetics. But a large part of it also environmental plays a large role in it. The exposure that the young people have. Keith talked about who you're with. You know, peer pressure is extremely important with young people. That environmental influence can take somebody who doesn't have any genetic predisposition and affect them. Things like trauma, sexual, physical, emotional abuse, and we see a lot of that in our young people, plays a large role in making people susceptible to addiction. One of the key things, though, is that, you know, when you understand alcoholism, you can find alcoholics that basically can drink for 15, 20 years and be very functional. I was one of them. I drank for 22 years, and I was highly functional for 20 of those 22 years. It wasn't until the last 2 years that it went out of hand. You're not going to find a heroin addict who's going to be functional in many cases for 20 years shooting heroin IV. And the reason for that is it affects the brain differently. The method of delivery of the drug plays a role in how the brain is going to get altered. And the brain gets altered a lot quicker when you do something like take a substance IV or you snort it. Our brain has basically evolved in a way that allows us to stay alive. We learn things based on our interaction with the environment. Many of the things that we're exposed to in our environment do not register. Because if we were exposed to everything that was of a sensory nature to us, we couldn't get anything done. So the brain has an ability to focus on things that are novel. And what happens is a structure in the brain called the amygdala monitors that environment, and when something unique happens in that environment, it sends a signal to the rest of the brain, particularly the frontal part of the brain, which then takes that information and starts to figure out what's going on based on your life experiences. And if it's something that's really unique, it comes back down to this structure called the hippocampus. And that's what we call associative learning. The brain functions by what it's exposed to. If you expose the brain to a certain series of experiences, the brain is going to wire itself to that experience. If you can expose it to something different, the brain wires itself that way. But it reacts initially to novelty. The novelty, and to make it a little simplified, you've got two areas of the brain, and this is really simplified, because I try to present this to high school kids and to parents. But you've got two areas of the brain. You've got this blue area of the brain, which goes through our frontal lobe. That's our intellectual, that's our reasoning part of the brain. The red area, that's our limbic system. That modulates survival. When things happen in our brain, when we're exposed to things, that limbic system will look at it and say, okay, if you do this, you're going to experience pleasure right now, or you're going to experience pain reduction right now. It doesn't consider consequences. The reasoning part of the brain that goes through the frontal lobe, it takes that same information in, and it says, yes, if you take this action, you will have pleasure, but let's look at it a little more broadly. What are the consequences? So it has the ability to kind of look at the situation and say, it's good or bad. These two areas of the brain are constantly working together with one another in order to optimize our survival or our well-being. And what happens is the frontal lobe has the ability, when the brain is working correctly, to basically slow down that limbic system and say, wait a minute, give me a little bit of time to think this thing through. That's what we call willpower. That's the ability to assess the situation and to make the right decision. When the brain is working correctly, it has the ability to basically say, okay, this situation is not good for me. That's the way the adult brain works, not the teenage brain or the young adult brain. It doesn't work that way. It's not wired. That wiring that we're talking about doesn't complete itself in a woman probably till she's 22, and in a man when they're 24, 25. So ladies, in some ways, you are a lot more advanced than men are. But I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. The young brain does not function all the time based on consequences. It functions on anticipation of reward. Because the ability of the brain to make the decisions, this is a bad thing to do, is not wired in completely. Now, that doesn't mean that young people can't make good choices. They can. But we have to understand that when exposed to a certain situation, their brain is not working like an adult brain does. And part of the reason for that is how it develops. When you look at what is it that gives the brain the ability to pick out good things to do, we have a chemical in our brain called dopamine. And what dopamine does is it basically provides that motivation for things that are going to allow us to stay alive, basically. That's what it was originally there for. Most people think dopamine's function is to feel good. It's not. We do feel good when dopamine's released. But what it really does is it creates a motivation to relive an experience. If that experience happened to be something for survival, that's really important. Now, what happens normally is, in the way the brain kind of decides whether something's worthwhile or not, we've got a baseline of dopamine that's firing all the time. When something unique happens that's not expected, dopamine gets fired. We feel good. And what it really does is it provides a motivation to re-experience that behavior. You know, I always used to talk about when I worked at Father Martin's, the chef at the time was terrific. And I used to go in there all the time for lunch, and I always had dessert. And one day he made apple pie. The apple pie didn't have any effect on my brain. Not because I didn't like apple pie, but because I've had it so often, you know, it wasn't anything a big deal. But Chef Mack had done something different this day. He had taken caramelized pecans and put it in the base. And I didn't expect that. And when I bit into that, I got a firing of dopamine. It felt really good. And every time I went in the cafeteria, that's what I was expecting. And again, this didn't happen, but what the scenario would have been, if I had gone in 2 or 3 times and I had gotten that, the brain gets conditioned to a certain experience. And what it does is the dopamine fires before you even experience it because it's anticipating that reward. And remember, dopamine is the motivation to continue the behavior. Now, that's a normal type of a thing that happens. Drugs and alcohol are a little different. When they first take drugs and alcohol, they get this bump of dopamine. And after a while, the brain gets conditioned to expect this. And what happens is the dopamine gets fired beforehand. That's the reason why you talk to many heroin addicts or opiate addicts or even alcoholics. They'll tell you when they're feeling dope sick, that dope sickness either goes away or lessens when they're on the way to the drug dealer. Why does that happen? Their brain is conditioned to know what's going to happen if they do that. So the thing to keep in mind is, especially with the young opiate addicts, is that when they get exposed to this drug or alcohol, or the situation in which they use the drugs or the alcohol, they're actually feeling this good thing, and from a neurobiological point of view, they're motivated to continue that behavior. What happens with drugs, though, which doesn't happen in a natural setting, in the first stage of addiction, they're anticipating this, but because drugs and alcohol actually activate the reward system directly, they get a second bump of dopamine. So what happens now is, as they continue to use through that first stage of addiction, their anticipated reward gets higher and higher and higher, which means there's more dopamine fire and more dopamine fire. The motivation is continuing there to get more and more because it feels so good. The way I use as an example, the best thing we can do to release dopamine naturally is to have sex. And if you looked at sex causing 100 units of dopamine to be released, drug and alcohol use releases 2 to 5 times that amount. So when the brain gets exposed to that, it has a feeling that, hey, this is something like I've never experienced before. And you want to continue to repeat that. That's that first stage of addiction. But what happens is, and here's where we get screwed as addicts and alcoholics. In the second stage of addiction, we reach that point where dopamine can't be released anymore. So what happens is it's got to compensate. And the way it compensates is it takes these natural rewards, food, sex, self-preservation, hobbies, social interaction, and it makes them less important. This is particularly true for our young people. So what happens now is, in that second stage of addiction, this natural reward drops down here. So the starting point for dopamine is not up here, but down here. And that second stage is where that compulsion kicks in. Now, for opiate addiction, what also happens in that stage is they develop that physical dependence. And once they hit that physical dependence, it's not just about consequences. Getting back to that limbic system, it's about avoiding pain. And as Keith talked about, what did he say? He's clean now. 5 years? Whatever it was. And he still gets that hit in the head. Maybe it'd be nice to do that. That's the insidious nature of this. And what it really has to do with is this alteration of the brain that's taken place is so radical, especially when you look at something like IV heroin use, that it's very difficult to eradicate that use. And when we can help people understand this, and we can help them understand how the brain functions, we have a little better chance of doing something about it. Now, the other aspect of addiction, because not all addiction develops from the point of view of that motivation to get that reward of feeling good. Some addiction develops because of the effect alcohol and drugs has on our stress system. Stress is not a comfortable thing. And what happens is, if you use drugs and alcohol, or let's back up a second, somebody who has been exposed to some kind of a trauma issue, what happens to this internal system to manage stress is it gets all out of whack, and they're hyper alert or hypersensitized to stress, which is very uncomfortable. So what happens to those people when they use a substance, alcohol, heroin, any kind of opiate, marijuana, their stress level drops dramatically. So sometimes their addiction develops simply because they're reducing that pain associated with the uncomfortable feelings of stress. And it's both of these issues that have to be addressed when you're looking at treatment. Now, the opiate cycle Well, first of all, just how addiction develops, the first thing that's going to happen is when you drink or drug, that reward center is activated and you get a big bump of dopamine. It feels really good. We want to repeat that behavior. But what basically is going to happen is the reward center gets activated, the frontal lobe takes on, and they start to learn people, places, and things that are associated with their drug use. As they continue to use, the ability to make good decisions drops. And as that's not the actual slideshow. The frontal lobe, which is the part of the brain that allows you to make decisions or control your impulses, is altered. And when that's altered, the ability to do these things based on logic is reduced. In the case of heroin and even alcohol, what you're going to get is, okay, you got the memory. The inhibitory control part of the brain starts to be lessened. They have less ability to make good choices. And then finally what happens is, because of the pain that they're exposing with withdrawal, their motivation to seek is extremely strong. Now again, unless you've experienced that kind of pain, it's hard to understand. You know, I've heard many parents tell me, well, why do they keep relapsing? And what most people don't understand is, when you complete treatment, especially if it's 28 days of treatment, the brain is nowhere near back to where it needs to be. And that memory of it is powerful. And if you put them in a situation now where things happen once they get out of treatment, especially they're under a lot of stress, that can reactivate this whole process. When you look at the addictive cycle, what you really have initially, I'm sorry you can't see this, when you start using your opiates, what happens is you activate some receptors in the brain called mule receptors. Mule receptors are those receptors in our brain that are there initially for modulating pain. They've got natural painkillers are endorphins. What happens is, the initial part of the opiate use is you activate those receptors, endorphins are released, and then the endorphin release sends a signal to the reward center, and dopamine is released. And here's where now you get that motivation to continue. So what happens is they feel good, they got increased rewards, so they continue to use, but then what happens is, in that second stage, those mule receptors, they've got to compensate. There's so much artificial opiate that's hitting there that what happens is those mule receptors start to multiply. And they become greater to kind of compensate for all the excess heroin or opiate that is in the system. Then what happens is, if you stop using, because you've got all these excess receptors, the cravings get extremely strong. How many of you ladies have had a craving for chocolate? And how many of you can say it's been pretty strong craving? Well, take that and multiply it by a factor of 5 or 10, and then you understand that craving that the heroin or the opiate addict has when they're in that withdrawal stage. It becomes so powerful. Natural dopamine starts to decrease. They don't get any real good feelings now, because those natural rewards of social interaction, friends, hobbies, interests becomes less important. This is not just for the young people, but particularly for our young people. This happens for everybody. Then what happens is, okay, second stage, they start to develop that physical dependence. You stop using the opiate, you go through withdrawal, physical pain, increased cravings, addictive use, and that cycle continues. That's the process that takes place. The key thing to keep in mind, though, is those mule receptors, they do not go back to normal within 28 days. It takes a lot longer period of time. And that's why it's so frustrating when we start to see people come in and out of treatment over and over again. But part of the reason for that is the understanding that it takes more time for this to kind of rebalance itself. And what is it? Well, first of all, with the opiate withdrawal, you got a couple of different stages of it. In that first stage, which lasts about 12 hours to 5 days, you're going to have depression, insomnia, diarrhea, vomiting, and abdominal cramps. 2 weeks out, you're going to have chills, dilated pupils, lack of motivation. And then up to 3 months, insomnia, restlessness, lack of motivation. But a key thing that a lot of people don't understand about opiate addiction and many other addictions is you have another concept called post-acute withdrawal. And that can go up to 2 years. 2 years after you stop using, you're still potentially can have this withdrawal feeling, especially if you're under a lot of stress. And that's a key component from a relapse prevention point of view. You've got to incorporate some really holistic approaches to treatment that include significant stress management approaches, plus education on exactly what post-acute withdrawal is. Because many, many times you'll find these young people, they're in treatment for 28 days, 90 days, they come out, they've got all these skills, but what happens to them is they're not prepared for life. So they're under a lot of stress, and all of a sudden this post-acute withdrawal kicks in, and bang, they're back in that cycle. And the unfortunate thing is, many of them think they can go back to where they started, and they shoot up too much in the beginning, and we never get another chance to help them. Here's what you have as far as one of those mule receptors. When it's not filled, you're going to have pain because that's its function. It's to modulate pain. When we experience pain, these receptors get activated. This is a natural painkiller. This is endorphins. What happens is, when it hits those receptors, that mule receptor, the pain is gone. So when you look at the opiate addict now who's got multiple of these mule receptors now over above what's normal, they're experiencing that pain all over. And it's an intense type of a pain. And it goes away as soon as they expose themselves to either a natural endorphin, and in most cases, because of their excess opiate use, there's not enough natural endorphins to deal with that. Something like Suboxone, methadone, what they do is they'll attach to those receptor sites more strongly than an opiate will and block it. And what it does is it'll calm down that receptor so that they don't experience the withdrawal pain. 5, 6 years ago, I would tell you that if somebody was in treatment for 28 days and they had stopped taking, they were clean off opiates, they should not be put on Suboxone. I don't feel that way anymore. I think we're dealing with too dangerous a problem that we have to take everything at our disposal. But you shouldn't also be giving Suboxone to everybody, and I think that's something where a clinician's judgment has to come in. But I do think we need, at least I've changed my whole idea on the use of Suboxone. I think that because it's a long-term problem, sometimes you need that extra help that Suboxone will give to manage it. Unfortunately, in the recovery community, some people still frown on the use of Suboxone. And I think that's something that has to be worked on. Something like naltrexone or naloxone, what they actually do is they block those receptors completely. And they'll knock any opiate on the receptor that's there, knock it out completely. When you understand again, and here's where I think it's important for parents to understand this. Somebody who is addicted to alcohol is 2 times more likely to use heroin. Marijuana, 3 times. Cocaine, 15, and prescription opiates, 40 times more likely. This is a background. Now, what do we do with this information? All right? And what are some of the treatment implications? Because these memories are stronger, you need to have at least a 90-day exposure. And many times it's more than that. If they're young people, inpatient is preferred to get them away from the source. Because their cravings are strong, some detox protocols may need to be lengthened, and some other medical interventions may be necessary to help them do that. Post-acute withdrawal, as I talked about, is a big issue that needs to be addressed, and education on that. And then the holistic approach to treatment, which includes things like stress management, individual and group therapy, 12-step exposure, and in the case of young people, life skills training. The better we can prepare them after treatment to get out, the better off they're going to be. And for young people, and again, young people in particular respond to peer pressure. If they can tap into a support system, especially a recovery support system, they've got less of a chance of using. Some of the colleges are doing this. I forget which is one, Texas Christian, I think, actually has a program for recovering addicts and alcoholics. When they enroll in the college, they go and they live in a halfway house on campus that prepares them for the school year. And then when they're in the school year, they still live in that house and they're exposed to the recovery community. So many of the colleges are starting to take this into effect. But for young people, we've got to find ways to enrich their lives. Old hobbies, music, things that are helping them regain some of that natural dopamine, life skill training. Impulse control is difficult with these young people. So we have to understand they're going to make mistakes. I'm talking about when they're in treatment, and how we approach them in treatment is important. Now, here's a prevention plan that I feel I'm trying to work on in my little world. It's something that I can do. Number one, I think what we have to do is we have to educate parents, teens, therapists as to what addiction really is, focusing on drug use and alcohol. We also have to take an approach on how the brain works, especially for our young people. Our young people, if they start to understand, and the parents in particular, how that brain works, then you can start looking at this a little bit differently. And again, for young people, they do not function based on assessment of risk. They function on anticipation of reward, because that assessment of risk part of the brain is not fully developed. The other thing we have to help parents understand in particular, and this is where I feel real strongly, because somebody said earlier that most of our heroin addicts start with prescriptions. They don't start with prescription. They start with nicotine and they start with marijuana. I have worked with, I would say 98% of the heroin addicts and opiate addicts that I've worked with in the 20 years I've been working in the treatment field start with marijuana or smoking. The gateway drug is not even marijuana, it is nicotine. A lot of our young people are vaping, and they don't understand the effect it has. Because their brain is so sensitive, things like marijuana, things like vaping, sensitize the brain and make them more susceptible later on. And I don't think there's a strong enough understanding of this within the parent community. And the more we can help them understand, again, I'm not disagreeing with anything that's been said. I think anything from a prevention and an education point of view is important. But we cannot minimize the effect of marijuana and vaping on the young brain. I'm not talking about marijuana being bad for everybody. I don't want to get into the political discussion on that. But I will say this, based on the fact that the young brain is not fully developed, we expose them to marijuana and vaping, it's going to increase the likelihood of sensitizing that brain and making them more susceptible to addiction. It also puts them in a lifestyle that makes them more likely to find something new. So we've got to take time to do that. And then finally, we need to help the parents understand what to look for and educate them on how to talk about it. Just as an example, a lot of parents that I've talked to say, well, marijuana is not a problem. I used it. I used pot when I was a kid. Well, the pot I use today is not the stuff that's on the market today. The stuff that's on the market today is so much more potent, so much more powerful, and it has more of an effect. And helping parents understand and how to tell kids, look, yeah, I used marijuana when I was a kid, but number one, we didn't understand what it does to the brain. We didn't understand brain development, and it's stronger. Helping parents understand, and somebody said, if you talk to the kids about drugs and alcohol, their chances of using are less. 42% increase or decrease in the likelihood of a child becoming an addict or an alcoholic from parents who consistently talk to their children about drugs and alcohol. So again, I don't have enough time to get into the last part of this presentation, but what I want to sum this up with is we've got a complex problem. Everything that is being done needs to be done. It has to be a multi-pronged approach. But the point of educating young people and parents on not just not to use drugs, but why and how that affects their future. Our young people today are smarter than I was. They're exposed to many more stimuli than I was, we were. They've got ability to understand some things, and if we can educate them properly so they don't get started into that process, maybe 15 years from now we can say we've made a major dent in this problem. But unless we take that complete approach, it's going to be difficult. And again, this is just my little take on it, and I hope I've helped some people understand some things, and I guess now we take questions, or?
Hi, John. Thank you so much. I'm sorry. In the interest of time, John's going to be available during the break, and Jeff and Julie, will you be available during the break as well? I know they're trying to get the next session and get us back on track. So thank you so much.